Hello, I'm Karen Bryla McNees, dietitian with the UKHR Health and Wellness Program, and this is Eating with Intention. This time around, we are talking about ditching the diet mentality. Before we get into some tangible tips about how to ditch the diet mentality, I think it's important to define what dieting is and where this diet mentality comes from. So, dieting is the practice of restricting or manipulating food intake according to external rules. Maybe rules such as what foods to eat or not eat, when you're allowed to eat or not eat, how much food you should eat or not eat. These are all examples of external rules. And dieting encourages people to follow these external rules instead of internal cues, such as your own hunger and fullness cues, satisfaction, enjoyment of foods. And the primary goal of all of this is to change your body size, shape, or weight. The diet mentality is the mindset and the thought patterns that accompany the act of dieting. So, to ditch the diet mentality, I think it's really important that we first understand what dieting culture is and the dangers of it. What are the hallmarks of dieting culture? There are many. These are probably some of the most noticeable ones. Dieting culture tends to equate thinness with health, meaning if you are thin, you must be healthy, which we know is not true. It also equates thinness with moral virtue. Perhaps you are labeled a better person, a person with more willpower, a more successful person if you are thin. Dieting culture definitely demonizes certain ways of eating. Think about, low carb diets, and it elevates other ways of eating, maybe such as an intermittent fasting regimen or, a keto diet. But it's very clear in dieting culture that, you know, some ways of eating are bad and others are good or better. It doesn't recognize what might be right or the best fit for each individual. Dieting culture definitely, as we've already touched on, values following external rules over honoring your body's internal signals. Some of you may be familiar with the phrase intuitive eating. And this is a way of eating that does honor your body's internal signals. So there's a lot of focus on learning to tune into your body's hunger and fullness cues, paying attention to the types of foods that make you feel more energetic and nourished and feel good in your body, and the foods that don't, paying attention to what foods you actually enjoy or do not enjoy eating, and finding a balance between the body's wants and needs based on these signals. But dieting culture encourages us to ignore all of that natural wisdom our body has. And so we get very disconnected from our own bodies and the wants and needs that it has. That's what makes dieting in the end really unsustainable for most people, I think. Diets are meant to fail, to be quite honest. You are not a failure. Diets have failed you, is what I always tell my clients. And that's a big part of it because you're following somebody else's rules that may or may not make any sense for you based on your needs, preferences, and lifestyle. Big hallmark of dieting culture, unfortunately, is shame and stigma around bodies that don't conform to the ideal. So, certainly internally, a lot of people feel shame about how their bodies look. Maybe they blame themselves for this. Um, there's also stigma from a larger cultural perspective in terms of it being a lot of people or institutions feel that it's okay to treat people differently based on their body size, shape, or weight. And so you do get discrimination and disparate treatment that happens for people in larger bodies. So, yeah, there are many dangers of dieting culture. These are just a few I want to be sure that we mention. Chronic dieting in particular can increase your risk of developing disordered eating or full-on clinical eating disorders such as binge eating disorder or anorexia. Dieting, especially again, chronic dieting, going on and off diets causes weight cycling. Some people call this yo-yo dieting, where you're, on a diet, losing significant amount of weight, and then you're off a diet, gaining the weight back, and you're just kind of going back and forth this way, jumping from one diet to the next, and your weight going up and down in response. But these, big swings in body weight up and down can actually harm your metabolism long term. And there's a good body of research that demonstrates this, that you're actually probably hurting and lowering your metabolism over time the more that you do this weight cycling or yo-yo dieting. It's also very hard on your heart. So people who have a history of weight cycling do have increased risks of uh, negative heart health and cardiac events. And we also see, of course, a lot of harm to people's psychological well-being when they're, kind of stuck in this dieting cycle and going on and off diets and having their body weight, go up and down as a result of that. Again, that's very, there's a lot of emotions that go with that while you're both losing weight and gaining weight, and that takes a psychological toll over time. Diet and culture, as we've already talked about, but I can't reinforce enough, disconnects you from your body's natural signals. Okay. I know I have a lot of clients who say, but I don't know what it's like to feel hungry, or I don't know how to tell that I'm full, or I don't know how to tell what foods I like or what foods fill me up or give me satisfaction. And so they think their body doesn't have that wisdom. But again, that's often a result of having been stuck in dieting culture and following diets for so long. Again, somebody else's rules, that you have lost touch with those natural signals. And it takes some work to find them again and reconnect with them, but it is possible. Dieting culture most certainly fuels body dissatisfaction because all of the focus is on body size, shape, and weight. It's not about health. It's not about quality of life. Okay. It also, as we've already mentioned, perpetuates weight stigma, weight discrimination, and ultimately, we're seeing too that it results in health inequities. There's a lot of folks. The research tells us who are in larger bodies who avoid healthcare because of some of the shame and stigma involved in that environment. We also see that people in larger bodies, when they do have a health complaint and they present it to a healthcare provider, the complaint is written off as something related to their weight and not explored or taken seriously when these might actually be serious medical things that need attention. And this is really interesting. And the, statistics bear this out. Dieting is the biggest predictor of weight gain. So if you want to know what gives me the biggest chance of gaining weight in the future, it's dieting, being on a diet. Okay. And diets in the way that I've talked about, so far. Strict, rule-based, all or nothing, black and white type diets. Okay, that's what we're talking about. I'm not really talking about a diet like following a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet or a Mediterranean diet. I would call those more, patterns of eating, perhaps. And that's a little bit different than the kinds of diets that we're talking about. Not to mention a lot of vegetarian or Mediterranean type diets, things like that are, more centered around health and improving health outcomes than they are being focused on body size, shape, and weight. So letting go of the diet mentality can be really scary, and I do want to honor that reality for people. Again, especially if you've been stuck in this vicious cycle of dieting for a long time, which many people are and have been, okay? It is possible to break out of it and let go of it. But again, once you maybe make that decision that, yeah, I want to get away from dieting culture and I don't want to follow somebody else's rules, it can feel really disorienting because you're like, well, what do I do then? I'm just used to doing what these other people and diets tell me to do. And again, that's where we have to turn inward and start connecting with some of those natural signals with our body and, kind of getting, trust established again between our bodies and ourselves. But you can see this vicious cycle of dieting, how it goes, and many of you may be able to relate to this. It starts with a desire to lose weight, right, or change your body size or shape. Then it's dieting, again, in this very kind of restrictive way that I've been talking about. And then inevitably you get cravings. You just generally might feel a kind of again, just that you're missing out on things, right? And that can lead to, again, the loss of control eating or overeating. Once that happens, and again, it's almost inevitable with these diets. They're designed to fail, like I said, right? So it's almost inevitable. You're going to get to this point where you feel overly restricted. You're not having any of the food you actually really love to eat. You're hungry all the time. And that is what triggers the loss of control eating and the overeating. So again, there's nothing wrong with you. It's an inevitable outcome of following diets like that. And then you get, of course, a regain of lost weight, and then returning to the desire to lose weight and kicking off the cycle all over again, maybe with a different type of diet that you think will work better the next time around. But the thing I really want people to remember from this is that, the reality is the restriction and the rules of dieting culture actually make you more likely to overeat and feel out of control. That's why dieting is the biggest predictor of weight gain because people just get stuck in that cycle. Okay. So again, if you want to feel more in control around food and not overeat, the answer is to not be dieting. All right, so let's get into some practical strategies for how we might start ditching the diet mentality and pushing back against it. I think this is a good place to start for a lot of people. Reflecting on what dieting has cost you. And maybe you've never really thought about it that way. But there are costs associated with it. And I think that really has to be the first step for a lot of folks to be committed to ditching the diet mentality because you have to get a little emotional, maybe a little angry, maybe a little resentful of, geez, look at the cost this has had in my life in these different ways. And that can actually be really motivating. I don't say this in a way that I want you to beat yourself up and be hard on yourself about it, but to be honest with yourself about what it may have cost you. Okay. There's some examples here. Perhaps it's cost you a social life in some way. Dieting also often means that people avoid social events that involve food. And we know that a lot of socializing, happens around food. So if you're someone who likes to be social or would like to meet new people or friends or partners, dieting might limit the opportunities for that. And even if you do allow yourself to go to social events that involve food, you may be so anxious about the food aspect of it that you're not really connecting with other people and enjoying yourself. Dieting almost certainly has cost people time. Okay. Um, I hear a lot of clients talk about, oh, I was trying to follow, whatever diet, Whole30 diet or something. And, it can be very time consuming to be able to plan meals that are kind of compliant with that diet, to maybe do special grocery shopping or extra grocery shopping you're not used to doing to get the things you need, and then preparing those meals each day or each week. Okay. So it can be a lot of time. Headspace as well. So thinking about the mental energy that dieting has perhaps taken from you that could have been used for other things, other areas for self-improvement or growth. And again, it's a lot of emotional energy too. So I think we can think of the headspace cost in that way too, of just the emotional roller coaster that dieting can be. Dieting, as we've mentioned, right, might affect your physical health. We talked about the yo-yo dieting, and how that can affect metabolism and heart health. But dieting also often does mean you are not fueling and nourishing your body properly. That maybe you are not getting enough calories to fuel your lifestyle. Maybe you are not getting enough carbohydrates, even though you're a very active person and you need that to fuel yourself. Okay. So yeah, they can be very restrictive and to the point where people are hungry and just put up with it because this is what they think it needs to be, right? To meet their goals. And again, I'm on the diet. I'm following the rules. This is what it is. And they think it has to be that way. That's what we've, taught ourselves. Dieting for a lot of people has probably cost them some money. Maybe you've invested in certain books. Maybe you've invested in online programs. Maybe you've invested in access to online accounts that give you, meal plans. Maybe you've actually subscribed to kind of meal delivery type kits, right? That help you be diet compliant. But the reality is most diets, again, in the sense that we're talking about them, are centered around getting you to spend money. They are there to make money. That's what I'd say probably 99% of these diets are about. All right. Maybe they're also encouraging you to buy special, supplements or, add-on foods or shakes and things like that. So it truly is a money-making industry that generally doesn't have your best interests at heart. And there might be other things I've not listed here that you can think of for yourself. All right. So tip number two. There's a group of things we call dieting tools, right? These are just some examples. And I'm not saying using these things is a good or bad thing. I certainly don't want to label them that way, just like I don't want to label foods as good or bad. But I do think these are tools we need to be very careful about how we use, okay? But some common dieting tools are a bathroom scale where you might weigh yourself. Some of them even come with these fancy features where it can, calculate your percentage body fat, although those calculations are notoriously inaccurate. Maybe a food tracking app like a Lose It or a MyFitnessPal that you track, everything you eat and, find out all your calories and macros for the day. Fitness tracker, right? Something like boy, I can't even think of the word right now, but the fitness trackers that track like all the steps you've taken and calories you've burned through physical activity, a food scale where you're measuring, weighing your food and measuring cups and spoons to help you control portions. And again, maybe diet compliant meal plans, right? That could be another dieting tool where you are only allowing yourself to, eat the foods or the meals on this particular plan. Okay. So these tools can tend, especially if you're, you know, doing a diet in kind of in the dieting culture, these tools generally keep you stuck in that mentality because they're reinforcing rules, or again, external rules from somebody else, obedience. So they're very much, saying you need, encouraging you to go along with this, and just, trust the plan. And also, encouraging some level of perfection. And that's what a lot of these diets are, about. We talked about that. They're very black and white. They're very all or nothing. That, it makes you feel like one little mistake and you've, screwed the whole thing up. And so a lot of these tools can, be kind of weaponized in these ways. I think these tools could be used responsibly, and effectively if someone was not on a diet or stuck in a diet mentality. I think that if you maybe are a more intuitive type eater and you have a flexible, sustainable approach to eating, then these tools certainly can be helpful. From that perspective. But we need to be very careful about how we're using them, um, and be honest with ourselves about what impact they may be having on us. Because again, when we're using them in that diet um, culture way, they can actually be quite negative for our psychological well-being. Reframe diet thought. Okay, this is a big one. I could have probably done a whole presentation just on this alone. But there's something in psychology called cognitive distortions. They're, basically thoughts, types of thoughts that we have that are not necessarily accurate or based in reality. They often tend to be more thoughts that are more based on emotion than fact and reason. Okay, but we all have them. We're all guilty of this. Okay, and there's many different types of cognitive distortions. These are some common ones that I think are particularly relevant to food and eating and dieting. And you might look through this list and think, boy, I have a lot of those kinds of thoughts or similar thoughts. Yeah, you might. You might not even recognize that you do. And so the first step is to really start recognizing what cognitive distortions you're having. What thoughts am I having that really need to be challenged, that are not helpful to me, that are not based in logic, fact, or reason, and thoughts that I need to push back against. Okay, so that's a start. Maybe you don't even work on reframing those thoughts at first. For a lot of people, it's difficult enough to just start noticing um, the cognitive distortions that they are having because they can feel so normal. We don't even identify them as like, oh, that doesn't make sense to be thinking that, right? They're just normal thoughts to us. So I think the first step is to just really get serious about trying to recognize when you have these thoughts. And then the next step would be trying to reframe them, right? Push back on them, examine the logic behind it. Try to approach, uh, the problem in a more rational and kind way to yourself as well. Beware of some of these words that indicate a diet mentality. These words down here are very, again, insidious. You probably use them a lot in relation to food. But be aware, again, because these words can signal underlying thoughts, okay, that are rooted in dieting culture. And so, even if you catch yourself saying, "Oh, this is a bad food, I shouldn't eat it," that might seem innocent, but you really do want to pay attention to that. Why did I label that food bad? Is it really bad? What does that mean to me? Where'd that come from? Um, is it really true that I can never eat something with added sugar in it? Let me examine that, push back on that, right? So just recognizing when you're using these words, how you're using them in relation to food, and challenging them and maybe replacing them with more flexible and forgiving language. How we talk to ourselves is really important, right? That self-talk that's happening. This is where we need to pay attention and dig a little deeper. And then finally, this is our last tip, practicing self-compassion. This is certainly another thing that is easier said than done. It does take some practice. Um, But there are three elements of self-compassion, okay? And I'm going to talk about why they make sense for helping us with the diet mentality. The three elements are self-kindness. So instead of punishing yourself when you have a perceived failure, you're trying to be understanding of yourself in the situation. A sense of common humanity. So again, when something, unwanted happens or something that you regret, you're able to tell yourself, okay, everybody goes through this. Humans, we're all imperfect. This is just part of life and living. And then finally, mindfulness, where you're not ignoring these feelings of failure you might have, but you're not exaggerating them either. And I think for most people, the exaggerating is the bigger issue. That's kind of how you start to descend into that, downward mental spiral of, beating yourself just beating yourself up, feeling like a failure. It's really hard to climb out of that. But some people cope by ignoring it altogether and just not confronting uncomfortable feelings. So neither one is really ideal. You want to be able to kind of observe and experience these feelings with a kind of like neutral awareness. And that's what this mindfulness is. But self-compassion helps you ditch the diet mentality in a few ways. It certainly helps reduce the shame and guilt around food, okay? Or again, perceived failures that you may have around food and eating. Because again, you're trying to show yourself some kindness and understanding instead of punishing yourself. That's where a lot of shame and guilt comes from. You're understanding that this is a common human experience. You're not alone. That helps reduce the shame and the guilt, right? Um, you're replacing punishment with growth and learning. So again, when we are having these exaggerated feelings of failure or punishing ourselves instead of being kind to ourselves, we're not learning. You can't learn in that mindset, okay? If you're too busy beating yourself up, you can't learn. And I guarantee you, there's always something to learn from, whatever perceived, failure you feel you have had. Okay. But we have to allow some mental space for that. And so that's where the understanding comes from. Let me, instead of punishing myself, let me think about what happened. Let me reflect on it. Let me figure out what I might be able to do differently in the future if a similar situation comes up. So this is how we learn and grow. Self-compassion certainly helps you recover from lapses more quickly because again, you move away from kind of the exaggerated feelings of failure, you move away from the punishment. And with that, you're more easily able to pick yourself up and move on to the next thing. And overall, I'd say self-compassion supports sustainable change, which is always what I want for people when it comes to nutrition. I want people um, changing their lifestyle and their habits in a way that feels sustainable, not in a way that they feel they're going to crash and burn like a lot of people do on a diet. Okay. A quick self-compassion practice you could start doing. It's kind of like three parts here. The first is just noticing a judgmental thought and that's really where the mindfulness is. You're just noticing, okay, I shouldn't have eaten that. That's the thought I'm having. But again, you're not ignoring it and you're not, again, moving into kind of a self-flagellation mode where you're going to be beating yourself up about it. You're just noticing that I'm having this thought, okay? You're going to try to pause and reframe it with some kindness. It's okay. I'm learning. This is new to me. I can make a different choice next time. Let me think about how I might do that. And then finally, connect to humanity, right? And that's that sense of everyone slips up sometimes. No human is perfect. I'm not alone in this. I'm not the first or the last person to ever experience this. Before I end too, I want to tell you about a research study I read once about self-compassion as it relates to food, because it's always stuck with me and it's pretty easy to explain. But they had, I think it was women only, but they had two groups of women, come in for this research. And they put the two groups of women in two different rooms. And each room, I had like candy and desserts and treats and things like that presented to them. And the researcher said, "Here, hang out for a while and help yourself to whatever of these foods that you want." Okay, enjoyable foods, but not necessarily nutrient dense foods, and a lot of foods that people, if you were dieting, would call bad foods, right, or forbidden foods. So the women are left there to eat these things. Okay, so the researchers come back. I think they take the food out, and then they give the half of the women, so the women in one of the rooms, they get messages of self-compassion, like little notes printed that say things like, "Oh, nobody's perfect, keep trying," and things like that, and if you're trying, you're not failing, and messages like that, okay, of self-compassion. The other women did not get those messages, and then they brought more food in, and they said, "Okay, help yourself to more food." The women that got the messages of self-compassion actually ate less of that food when it was brought out the second time compared to the women who did not get the messages of self-compassion. They ended up eating more of that food when it was brought back. Okay. So the idea is that those messages of self-compassion mediated how those women felt about what they ate that first time around. So the guess was, right, that, or the theory was, those women were probably feeling some level of guilt about having eaten the treats and all of that, right? The first go round. Um, and once they got those messages of self-compassion, it kind of pulled them out of that, right? It pulled them out of that, punishment and feeling like a failure and all of that, where they were able to recover from maybe a perceived failure. And then when the food was presented again, they they were able to make, probably what they thought were better choices. Whereas the women who did not get those messages of self-compassion were probably stuck in that punishment mode, that feeling of guilt mode, that feeling of failure mode. So when more food was brought out, they just gave into that even more because they were, again, kind of stuck in that emotional reaction cycle to the first time around. That probably sounds pretty familiar to a lot of you, but I really think that that study shows the power that self-compassion truly can have. But it takes work, and all of this takes work in terms of ditching the diet mentality. I know I had that little graphic there that was somebody throwing something in a trash can. It's not quite that simple, right? For a lot of us, right, you've been steeped in this diet culture for years or maybe even decades, and it can really stick in your mind, okay? And you have to be patient with yourself, again, kind to yourself as you work through this to really try to get those thoughts unstuck. It is a process, and it doesn't happen overnight. And I think even for people who feel like they're not in the diet mentality or who have never been, dieters per se, I find that a lot of those kinds of dieting culture thoughts can still be knocking around those people's minds too. It's almost like osmosis, even though you're not trying to absorb those thoughts and keep them. It just happens because it's so pervasive in our society. So um, be patient with yourself, show yourself some grace. Thank you today for joining me, and I will hope to see you again at a future event. Thank you. Bye.